Bruce DuMont back in Chicago. Thank you very much for joining us. We begin hour number 2 of our broadcast this evening. Kent Gray is here. He is a supporter of Donald Trump. He's also an attorney, drove up to Chicago from Springfield. Stephanie Hitt is our other Republican this evening. She's a conservative commentator from beautiful Evanston, Illinois, and has a daughter in the Air Force Academy. And actually is here tonight because you couldn't go to the Air Force Academy because
exactly. I had to cancel my trip.
They had to cancel your trip.
It was supposed to be Chicago night. Where thanks to all the great Chicago restaurants and sports teams who donate tremendous amounts of food and sports jerseys to give the young cadets, a little taste of home. It's the most popular night at the Academy. Everybody wants to eat the Chicago dogs and pizza. So a shout out to everyone who supports it. We'll be doing it again in the fall.
Okay.
So.
That's why you're with us tonight.
To donate, and the sports teams have been great. Everyone loves a Cubs jersey.
And Ray.
Easy, I'm a Cardinal. Hold on.
Easy. I'm a Sox fan. He's a Cardinal jersey. We can now fight. A fight is broken out. In lieu of baseball, the fans are still on edge.
No, Democrat or Republican, but I draw the line at Cubs and Sox.
Ray Lopez also joins us. Ray is the alderman and the ward committee, the Democratic ward committeeman of the 15th ward. And for those from around the country, give us some neighborhoods or even people in Chicago that might know either important landmarks that might be in your ward.
It's the southwest side of Chicago, the Stockyards, like the back of the Yards neighborhood, historic Brighton Park community, West Englewood, Gage Park, a lot of the historic neighborhoods that basically intersect around 55th and Western, 47th Street and Western. High immigrant neighborhoods, always for generations, whether it was Italians, Lithuanians, now Mexican, as well as Chinese, and a strong historic African American population as well.
Okay, and Mark Casello also joins us from the Calumet College of St. Joseph, also a associate professor of English for many, many years. And Ray, before the break, you sort of startled us when you said that maybe what the president should have done is maybe close the gates to other countries other than just the ones that you mentioned in Europe last week. You kind of surprised us. Would that include Mexico?
It would include everywhere. I think that if we were to have full grasp of the fact that this is a global pandemic, a global virus where we're getting attacked from all fronts, then it would have made great sense to me, and I think many people who I've talked about this with, to give every American a window to come home and say we are suspending all international flights in and out of this country so that we can, at best, keep the contagion that's here minimalized and prevent any new virus contamination from making its way to our shores.
Kent Gray, if someone made that suggestion to President Trump, what do you think his reaction would have been?
I think he probably would have been for it, and I think everybody around him would have said that he would have been eaten alive politically, especially if this turned out to be one of the previous viruses that were not quite as bad as this one has been so far.
He already got a lot. I mean, the reaction when he shut down flights to China was pretty. I mean, he was called everything that you can imagine, and
starting with racist, which is the general
racist,
thing
xenophobic, all of those things
Okay.
that were said about his policies regarding Mexico were now being applied to that, and now it's turned out to be the best decision.
Mark, do you agree with that's how the opposition to the president would have reacted to this suggestion?
Well, the problem was early on, there was a movement to make this the Chinese virus and to vilify Chinese Americans, Asian
Well, it is
Americans.
the
That's where it
Chinese
came
virus.
from.
I don't think anybody was vilifying them, but it's from China.
It's where it's
It's
from.
it's called facts.
But we have a pandemic at this point, and so you don't want to have a segment of your society being fear mongering against a segment of our society.
It's not a segment of our society. It's a country in the world.
Right, but there are Asian Americans, I'm certain, maybe they'll call in, who've experienced incidents of discrimination and mistreatment over the past.
I've heard in New York that is true.
Certainly.
It's sad
But
that there are ignorant people.
I want to
out
come
there.
back to Ray. Ray, you made a very dramatic comment. Now, my question is if you would have made that suggestion and you would have gotten coverage because of it, because of who you are and where you're coming from, would you acknowledge that many of your Hispanic colleagues either here or elsewhere around the country, they would have come down on you for suggesting that Mexico be basically quarantined.
Well, I think if I would have just said Mexico, then yes, I'd come off as being racist. But I think what I've said is that every country, everyone should not be allowed, no more international flights from anywhere from outside of the United States coming here.
Including Canada.
Including, yeah, I was going to say including Canada.
Everywhere. All international flights into and out of this country should be suspended. And I think if you make it about the fact that it is a global pandemic, that it is coming not just from China, not just from Europe, but it's making its way all throughout the globe, and that we have to protect our own people here that are in this country, that we need to address that. And, I think that the problem, and this goes back to the perception about with the tweets and the MAGA hats and all of that, is that if you were just focused on the science, if you just focus on what we need to protect our country, if we just focus on what's truly important, that he could have actually made that pronouncement. And yes, there would have been people who obviously would have said it was a racially motivated or just trumping Trump. And as your listeners know, I'm not a Trump fan.
Nope.
But he would have been in the right. He would have had the moral high ground to make that argument from the very beginning, especially now. And I think that if he were to tone down the racial arguments and tell Kevin McCarthy to quit calling it the Chinese virus, whatever we disagree here, if you tone that down and focus on the good of the country, you still can make this argument that international flights into and out of this country need to be suspended.
Well, one of the things we talked about a little bit earlier was that, this virus over these last few weeks has really had sort of two phases. There was the original initial phase in January, where it was the Wuhan virus. People called it that. That's where it came from. But we're now, and we reacted by shutting down flights. And the focus at the time was really what's going on in Asia, the comings and goings there, and so on. What's interesting is this virus has taken the reaction has taken a different pan as it has spread to Europe. So now we're like in phase 2, as someone says, where now the virus is coming from Europe, from Italy, Spain, and these places. So, and I think with that, we've noticed that it's not really called Wuhan anymore. People aren't mentioning Wuhan. They aren't watching. Right. That I think just naturally people are now calling it COVID-19, right. and the discussion now is really not about Asia. It's about Italy. Mm-hmm. It's about cruise ships.
Right. And Spain.
Spain is now the next
and France,
one.
Right, and France.
And
France, by the way, has also closed bars and restaurants.
Right, and that's that's I think. Our reactions and all that is it's fluid, but I think it's also sort of reasonable given the stages that we're in.
When we come back,
I'd prefer not to have Italian citizens, Iranian citizens, Chinese citizens that had been exposed to it, or anybody from any other country that has lax public health safety. I mean, it's an America first type situation, but we've got to protect our citizens.
Do you think, this is a quick answer from you, Kent, do you think we will get to the point within, let's say, the next 3 months that it will be the whole, that we will be shut down as a country? And we will not have people from Mexico or any other country coming to the country?
I don't think Mexico doesn't seem to have much of a problem right now, so I hope it's not shut down to anybody right now.
If this disease continues to increase by 30% every day, we will be at that situation.
Bruce DuMont back. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to go to calls in just a moment, but I do want to ask Ray, because something else that's been happening is obviously we have primary elections coming up this Tuesday in Illinois and Ohio and Florida and Arizona. But again, some states, including Louisiana and Georgia, they have announced the cancellation of their upcoming primaries. They were actually in a couple of weeks, but they pushed them back to May. And tomorrow is an election day in Illinois. As an official ward committeeman, what are some of the election-related things that you might expect to see tomorrow, Ray, in your ward?
Well, I'm anticipating that we're going to see diminished day of voting. Early voting in the state of Illinois has been up, in Chicago has been up. But I think this really highlights the need for us to change the way we hold elections. and possibly do something that I've been a long supporter of, which is automatic vote by mail, so that you can weather these kind of incidents without having to totally disrupt the electoral process. I could not imagine the disruption if this had happened in November during a presidential election and everyone's scrambling, the disenfranchisement, the fact that we're going to see whether or not our seniors actually come out to vote out of fear of the coronavirus. And even in Chicago now forcing voters to stand on the outside, kind of like for occupancy reasons.
That's a new thing.
That's a new thing this year, as well as the fact that, this year in the switch to make it more safe, all of the polling locations have touch screens, and now we learn that the coronavirus is transmitted by, particles
Touch.
of
So you have to
touch.
bring your wipes
So
to
it's going to be
Yeah.
a constant battle this cycle.
Well,
So
and
we'll
the-
see.
a lot of polling places are in nursing homes.
Well, all of them,
those will
most of
all
them have
be-
been pulled.
Yeah.
All those will have to be changed, and
I think it's going to be interesting to see over the next few weeks how the Biden voters come out to seal this for Joe Biden. I think the Bernie supporters, just demographically, are probably more. They're younger. I think they're probably a little more never care kind of folks generally
Out
that
at the
I know.
bars and-
And they're the folks that caused J.B. Pritzker to close the bars and restaurants. So.
Well, the
We should
established.
mention, by the way, for those listening around the country, we announced at the beginning, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker has announced that the bars and restaurants in Chicago are going to close after business tomorrow. They will not be open on Tuesday. And part of that was he was really ticked off in a Saturday afternoon press conference. He was really ticked off because so many young people had come out and were drinking in bars all over the city, that should not be news to anyone that lots of people come and drink starting at 10 o'clock in the morning in bars in Chicago. But he was very upset about it yesterday, and he talked about it on Meet the Press today. And then it was 2 or 3 hours after Meet the Press that he finally came out and said, okay, we're going to close the bars and we're going to close the
Right.
restaurants. But he should not have been surprised that 20-somethings were
Well,
not
and
going to
there is a
stop
little
drinking
concern
because
that,
of their care for their
his,
grandparents.
His anger, his personal anger
Yeah.
at his situation shouldn't necessarily be what determines what's a very
But it was
extreme
personal anger.
decision. Yeah, exactly. So I
Prohibition
was a little
doesn't work very
troubled with
well in
that.
Chicago.
Yeah,
There's a whole bunch
and-
of weird doors being jimmied open
No.
around the
But,
city
I mean,
tonight.
Oh, yes.
You should never. I mean, closing those
Speakeasies return.
businesses.
Yeah.
Closing those businesses should not be done lightly because that's exactly the industry, the businesses that are being hurt the most. And
Chicago's
and-
number one industry is tourism.
Well, exactly.
and they
Chicago
employ a
for
lot of
restaurants,
people.
and those are the kinds of businesses that can't recover.
The
from something
interesting
like
thing
this.
about life post 9/11, for those that went through it, is that the world stopped and then it slowly came back over a few weeks back into, and this has been a slow motion in the reverse. This has been a drawdown at various points, stair steps. The governor's choice today, various governors. This has been a stair step, and basically this week is the week that the world stopped. I think from in a lot of ways around the United States. And the question is, there probably isn't a president walking out and doing the first pitch at the World Series or a lot of these other
Opening
stuff
day.
because
We don't
there's
even know when
not
opening day
there's
is.
not
It's
a
the
point
opposite,
there's not
right.
a point where this virus is going to be like, okay, everything's better now. We can all move forward. Everything can open up on the same day, and we're finally done with it. This is going to be a major issue for months and
Right.
potentially
'Cause
years
we
as
don't
we
know.
spiral
Just
back.
because
Not
we're,
over.
we're slowing it down doesn't mean we're ending it. And just sort of like what China's trying to decide is the more that they ramp back up to normalcy, at what point they'll be like, nope, the virus is not gone. We got to go backwards again. So that's something that we really have to be very careful for a country. People are already talking about cancellations into the summer.
And the danger of ramping up too early is that
Right.
you might give the virus an opportunity to mutate, and then we have a whole new
Or
problem.
revive, yeah.
Let's go to calls. Let's go to Edward, listening to us on WCGO in Chicago, Illinois, our flagship station. Go ahead, Edward.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. So I was going to say that I thought it was a mistake for the government to allow those planes to come in. I think they should have been forced to stay over there, especially after what happened in 9/11. I mean, you, Bruce, were over there in Europe. You didn't exactly come back the same day or the
No.
next day. So I think that's something that should have been happening. And I got a text from
Well, the one
Brent-
thing I would say about it, because I think you're right, is the president was sort of unclear when he gave his announcement that Americans would be coming home. He gave them a couple of days. I thought it was the end of the day yesterday. So a lot of people were coming back, but this seems to be something that either the government or the airlines should have figured out, that everybody was going to rush to get on the early planes. They could have limited the number of planes that were coming back as long as they let all the Americans know in Europe that they were going to be able to come back. Because again, what's happened in not only in O'Hare Airport in Chicago, but around the country, the major airports, they were all just inundated with people coming in, and there wasn't enough. And again, I think this is criticism of the federal government, which is what Governor Pritzker was talking about. There were not enough people in place to process everybody getting off those planes.
And I want to say, as someone who used to work in the airline industry, the federal government gets a report every day how many people are coming in. So they were well aware of how many people were going to walk through those doors at customs, at O'Hare, at Dallas-Fort Worth. Their failure to plan is what caused the 6-hour delays and panic at the
Could this have
airports.
been done in European soil, or because the president didn't give our European allies a lot of notice that this was going to happen, would they have been reluctant to cooperate if they had these tests at the airports?
So what I would have suggested, particularly for O'Hare, is the international terminal is a terminal all to itself.
Right.
What they should have done was close the terminal off only to those arriving, and made sure that whether it was immigration and border that does customs, or if the military had to be involved as well to help facilitate, they should have been able to create a pathway for those individuals there, whether inside the terminal or in makeshift tents waiting to get through, but process them in a way that would contain it.
I understand that Dan Ronan, who is our guest, coming up at 8:30, he is on the line right now. He joins us from Washington. He is a correspondent for Transit Topics, but I understand you have breaking news that's happening right now. Dan, go ahead. You're on the air.
Hey, Bruce, the Centers for Disease Control a short time ago announced that they are recommending, and the key word here is recommending, it's not an edict, it's a recommendation, that for the next 8 weeks, there be no public gatherings of people in groups of larger than 50. So they're saying that we need to have a very, very concentrated, time period, 8 weeks here, where no gatherings of people larger than 50 is what the CDC recommendation is tonight that just came out a short time ago out of Atlanta, out of their office there.
Well, we thank you stay on the line. We thank you for that news, because obviously 50 is a long way from 100 or 250 and even 100 in some of the bars in Chicago. I mean, the number of people that are going to be out of work or potentially out of work is pretty rapid. Dan, we're going to bring you into the conversation now. You're a few minutes early, but Dan Ronan, he follows the transport industry. And let's begin the conversation, Dan, about all of the ripple effect of everything that we've been discussing this evening, and where those ripples lead when it comes to how the supply chain that we use in the United States to get the medical and food supplies that we will need.
Well, it's a huge deal, Bruce, and to your guest as well. It is a huge deal because, as we've seen over the last several days in grocery stores, the store that I go to not far from my house was pretty busy. And indeed, you see these pictures that we've seen on social media where people are running out to buy, the Charmin or Scott's tissue by the boxful. Well, all of that material has to come into those stores on trucks. And as a result of this, a story that I followed at Transport Topics, Walmart and a number of major retailers are announcing that they're going to start limiting the hours of their stores that they're open. They'll be closing most of their Walmart stores or giant food stores here in the Washington, D.C. area. Harris Teeter will be another. They'll be closing them at 11 o'clock at night so that they'll have time on the overnight shift to bring people in, to stock those stores, to make sure there are canned goods, to make sure that there's fruit, to make sure that there's things like paper towels. And that's a big deal. And, the trucking industry, Bruce, moves about 70% of the items in this country. I just saw a story that just popped up on my phone a couple of minutes ago that said that Amazon is now starting to become a little bit worried that they are going to have some spot shortages in some of their fulfillment centers, and that people who are expecting things to be delivered in a day or two, like we normally have gotten in this day of e-commerce, that instead it may take a little bit longer to stock stores. So the retailers, the people who are in this industry, are realizing that there's a potential problem out here, and they're trying to spread the supply chain out, lengthen it a little bit, so that we don't have this huge crush like we saw this weekend.
Give me a 15-second answer if you can. Do we know yet how many manufacturers of some of these core products, let's focus just on medical products, do we know how many of them are made in China and how much of that could be brought back to some domestic production?
I don't know the exact answer about the percentages, but there is a lot. And already ports like Los Angeles and others have been reporting in the last month that their inbound freight has been down 20-25%.
Okay. 1-800-723-8289 is the phone number. We're talking to Dan Ronan. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Our guests in Chicago, they continue. Back shortly with your calls. 1-800-723-8289. Bruce DuMont back in Chicago, and we're going to go back to Dan Ronan and also take some calls. But before we do, and Dan is on the line joining us as well, but Mark Casella, you mentioned that once upon a time you worked for Walmart in a management capacity, and you had some other things to add about the shelf life of things at Walmart.
Sure. So on a very busy night at a busy Walmart, you might have 3 semis come in with about 52 pallets of merchandise on each semi. And then you need crew to unload those manually down a manual conveyor belt and then stock those shelves. At peak seasons like this, you might be receiving 4 trucks, and that merchandise is flowing from distribution centers that Walmart has throughout our communities. But what also happens is that those distribution centers are served by products coming from overseas. Much of Walmart's products, as you've seen, are produced in China and elsewhere. And there's a 4 to 6 lead time on those goods coming from other countries. So if we deplete those supplies of those area distribution centers, we might see shortages for 4 to 6 weeks. And I speculate that Amazon might be facing the similar supply chain difficulties.
Tom, describe for us, if you will, because you represent an entire industry, what is the communication process within that industry, and how much communication is there with government officials who may be sharing their needs with you or your needs with them?
I'm not sure what you're asking me, but...
you know what? I was going to Dan Ronan. Tom, are you there?
My name's Tom.
Okay, I was going back to Dan Ronan. Dan, are you there?
Yes, Bruce.
Yeah, that question was for you. We're going to be on with Tom in just a moment, but
hey, Tom.
Let me repeat the question. How much communication is going on between the industry that you represent and the federal government or state governments and vice versa? Are they letting you know in advance some of the needs they're going to have, or are you sharing with them some of the concerns, positive and or negative, that you might have that they should know about in advance?
Well, I think there's a lot of communication going on along between the two sides. The ATA, the American Trucking Associations, is one of the biggest, associations in the country in terms of its political strength and its ability to get things, to get in touch with folks at the White House. In our role at Transport Topics, Bruce, we're playing the role, in the same role as you as a reporter. And while our publication is owned by ATA, we're hearing a lot that there's a lot of communication day in, almost on an hourly basis between officials at the White House and the various other government agencies.
Now, I understand that the CDC recommendations don't apply to businesses, schools, or universities. Is that correct?
That's what I've just heard. Yeah, I was just in the break. I was looking for that information here on the web, and that is correct, that those are exempt as far as the CDC recommendation. So it is a smaller subset, but it still is a rather large one indeed.
Let us take another call. Let's go back to Tom, who was standing by in Pennsylvania listening to us on WPIC. Go ahead, Tom. You have a question for us.
I'm actually in the Youngstown, Ohio area.
Okay.
I've got some comments to make about this, Bruce.
Sure.
First of all, I think we substituted one March Madness for another March Madness.
Yes.
And that, we've had coronavirus, but I think more of an epidemic of chicken little virus. And I say that because there have been, as of yesterday, 58 deaths in this country. Now, we've had over 18,000 deaths from the regular flu as of the first part of February in this country. And, you know, what I'm getting at is that when you put it in perspective, and I can go through all the numbers, I'm sure you're familiar with it, 61.8 million of people got swine flu, 500,000 deaths worldwide. We're not nowhere near that worldwide. I think your guest said 9,000. This is, you know, may well turn out to be a very expensive fire drill. It may dissipate on its own in April or May. And it's important because we're throwing all this money at it in terms of lost economy, which could lead to another major recession or depression. And many people die from stress-related illnesses in terms of heart disease, compromised immune system, and for that matter, murders and suicide in major economic poor situations. Now, the mixed feelings I have about this, though, are that, number one, we ought to get the press under control because they've been panicking since Trump got in there. And I think that's...
Well, I don't think you're going to get the press under control because they like to...
Well, having standards.
Okay.
Now, the other thing is that I think it's important. I think this has demonstrated to us, number one, we do need to build the wall on the southern border. And secondly, that we need to spread all the concentration of production that we have in China to other countries and bring some of it back home, not only from the medical end, supply end of things, but also parts for automobiles, computers.
Okay, good. Tom, that's a very good point, and I want all of our guests, including Dan Rowan, to comment on that. But I want to start with Mark Costello. Does this represent an opportunity where, in a bipartisan way, Congress can get together with the Congress, House, and Senate and come up with a plan that says, buy America first, or get a lot of these things that are manufactured around the world, bring them back to the United States or to countries close to the United States where we're not, an ocean away from and feeding, the beast in China?
I'd just like to step back to something Tom said at the outset, which was his concern about that this may be an overreaction. And I have family and friends in Italy. 2 days ago, the fatality percentage among the known cases in Italy was 7%. And that's due to an overwhelming of the capacity of the healthcare system. We have a limited number of hospital beds in this country. We have a limited number of intensive care units. About 5% of the people who get the virus may need that intensive care. And so the real danger here is if we spike too early, the fatalities come from just a lack of the ability to care. Right now, we haven't overwhelmed that system. People are able to get treatment, and so we're able to keep the fatalities relatively low. But we can't promise that in a week or two if people don't begin to self-isolate and we don't take these measures seriously.
Ray Lopez.
Well, I think going back to what I said earlier about closing our borders for travel is definitely a must, although I don't know if the wall would have helped because obviously Mexico is probably the most safest country on the planet right now.
They might start building it.
They might
us out.
they might
I'm
pay
going there,
to keep
yeah.
us there, keep us out. But I definitely think that, looking at our infrastructure, to Dan's point, finding ways to rebuild the America's capacity to be self-reliant. This exposes that great weakness. This has exposed a lot of weaknesses in our system across the board. And even if this is a fire drill, we're failing right now. And thank God it's a fire drill from that perspective. But I don't think it is.
Well, and it's funny because I've been having these very same conversations with friends and family and so on, and that is that, when you look at the absolute number of deaths in the country and taking out of that, a significant number of them from one nursing home in Seattle, we're not talking big numbers. We aren't. And so as tragic as those deaths are, it's not in the league right now as those of the flu. However, one of the things that I would have liked to have heard from the pronouncements over this week from our federal government is looking to the future.
Right.
And
Projections.
what are we doing to the biomedical tech departments? We should be developing, our antibiotics here. We should be doing these things here. Why are we? That's
Well,
where
I think those are the discussions that need to be had. They may not need to be had now. They might be started now, but I want to.
we should do it now because I think that one of the things that I
But
love
right
about
now,
this,
everybody is scared to death. In other words, I agree with you
Right.
that we should find other ways. I said this almost on day one. Why are we waiting for anything? It talk about a national security problem. We have
Right.
a national security problem that we're waiting, for China to give us masks or respirators.
we should be doing them. We should
be doing that now. But my question to you, from a political standpoint, Kent, this seems to be a perfect issue for Donald Trump, who says that he wants to bring back jobs to the United States and bring back manufacturing. This seems to be a perfect thing built for him.
He was talking about this before this even happened.
Right.
And, and some other folks have been too. There's a guy that did several books about accidental superpower and absent superpower. He has a new one out just recently. And he basically made a comment last week. He said, this is the future today, because a lot of this manufacturing in China was already coming back onshore. And if it wasn't coming to the U.S., it was going to Mexico for some transport reasons and some tax reasons and some new NAFTA reasons and stuff like that. But we've got to look forward when the legislature is finally able to get moving on ways that we put this back together. Is we used to have back post-World War II national defense focus on industries. It might be steel, it might be aluminum, it might be things that we need to have, shipbuilding, that kind of thing. And we need to basically put in some things into law that says there's preference on biddings, for instance, for U.S. made on some of these antibiotics, on certain drugs, on things that we view as critical to the national security. And hopefully our leaders will work together in a bipartisan manner to put that legislatively into place over the next few years.
You ask why isn't Donald Trump sort of this is his? I think at some point we will. He got
now's not the time to do it.
No, now's not the time, and he got reamed for what he did about closing the borders to China. So that he's in a way, I think we're seeing a little bit more mature Donald Trump because he's not using this as his platform right now.
Well, it shouldn't be right now. When we come back, Dan, I want to come back to you when we continue in our next segment, because obviously behind the trucking industry, there are a lot of truckers. There are rules and regulations put in place by the federal government as to when drivers can drive. And when we come back, I want to hear about the ramifications and the ripple effect of changing schedules for those that move America's products. Don't go away.
Hang on just 1 second, guys. I'm going to take that closer.
So if people want to.
Bruce DuMont back in Chicago. I'm going through the moment here when we talked about the recent CDC recommendations insofar as 50 people or more for the next 8 weeks. No gatherings of 50 or more. That does not apply to businesses, schools, universities, festivals, concerts, weddings. So that's a broad.
So what's the
they
point?
haven't killed the
that's
wedding
not
business.
much.
Yeah.
No, they've killed the
About
wedding
funerals.
They've
business.
killed the they've killed the wedding.
Funerals, yeah.
All right, what do we do? By the way, let's go back to Dan Ronan. Dan, are you still with us in D.C.?
Yeah, of course.
Very good. The question I asked is, there are all kinds of rules and regulations for those who drive our highways professionally. What impact or what changes will need to be made to move the products that may have to be moved in a very large and fast manner?
Well, those changes are already taking place, Bruce. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, that's the Department of Transportation sub-agency that manages and regulates the trucking and the bus industry. They came down with a rule yesterday amending what's called the Hours of Service Rule. This rule has been around since 1938, and it's got very specific rules about how long a truck driver can drive in a 14-hour period. So they've suspended several sections of that rule specifically as it relates, and I want to read this, drivers will be allowed to carry these following items. We're talking about medical supplies, testing equipment, masks, gloves, hand sanitizer, food, and personnel. So if you're a truck driver and you're carrying any one of those items to and from, it doesn't matter where you're doing it, you will be exempt from the hours of service rule. So you could drive longer than 11 hours. Drivers are now allowed to drive 11 hours in a 14-hour window. So this will suspend that. It's parts 390 to 399 of the FMCSA rules. And the thinking is this will get more trucks on the road. This will get more equipment on the road. This will get more product to the stores and to the hospitals that really need these items.
Will it also possibly lead to more accidents?
Right.
You know, anything's possible. But you would hope that in this case, the drivers and their companies would be very smart in terms of managing their own situation, managing their fatigue, and being very careful about it. This emergency declaration has been used hundreds of times for hurricanes and for natural disasters. It was used recently last summer when we had some hurricanes, as you know, along the East Coast. We had hurricanes on North Carolina, South Carolina. It was used there, but only for that region of the country. This is the first time that this rule has been suspended for all 50 states. So this has never been happened before since 1938 when this rule came in during the FDR administration.
Are there other things that are being planned by the transit industry that we have not yet discussed this evening? Reactions to this?
I think that, as I said, we're looking at stores doing what they can do to try to mitigate rushes like we've seen over the weekend. I think you're going to see that trucking companies, it's going to be all hands on deck here if it's not already. I think you're going to see that's going to be the case in the next couple days. I think those particular trucking firms that specialize in carrying some of these things, and there are companies that specialize in just carrying certain specific items, and if they're in that particular vertical, they're going to be moving items, and they're going to be moving things as fast as they can to get them, whether it's to a hospital, whether it's respirators or masks, whatever it is. I think you're going to see more of that. So I think, the trucking industry always rises to the occasion. They're a lot like first responders. They're, the people that, are bringing the goods in, the bottled water, the pallets. They're bringing the things in after the hurricanes, after the big calamities. I think you're going to see that same type of response.
Could there also be, if you fill up one of these semis with toilet paper or with bottled water or whatever the medical supply might be, is it possible that they would just be parked at some location and people would make their purchases right then and there, directly from the truck?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I know that when FEMA does these things and they start to stage for hurricanes, they have staging areas 90, 100, 150 miles outside of the hurricane zone, and they're ready to go. So as soon as things, begin to get anywhere back to normal, they start to bring those things in. So there could be, this is done standard practice in weather calamities.
Right. We just want to make sure the president doesn't start throwing toilet paper rolls at people. That would be a bad photo op, right, Ken? Bad photo op.
People don't
Wouldn't
like
be the
that. I
first.
thought that was nice. I didn't have a problem with that one.
TP'd for a while.
By the way, I want to clarify something information that I misinformed everybody, and that is the limit on festivals, weddings, and concerts does include 50. And that is the limit, 50 for the next 8 weeks. I think I said that there was.
But that's a recommendation.
It was a recommendation. Recommendation at the moment.
And you'll see some states probably adopt that and make that
Dan,
requirement.
because this is unlike a weather calamity, it is affecting the entire country, and we're looking at something that's not, maybe a month long, but maybe several months. What is this doing to employment opportunities in the trucking industry? And
that's a great question.
Because now it's almost like we're going to have a transference of labor in this country, where the entertainment industry is going to find itself very much underemployed.
That's a great question.
So
it's hard to become a truck driver. You have to get a CDL.
Exactly.
It's hard to be, but the industry already has a shortage right now of about 61,000 truck drivers. We have tremendous turnover in the industry because the trucking companies have been increasing pay and handing out bonuses to keep and retain drivers. There's a lot of churn in the industry, but I think right now with people maybe hunkering down and staying in the jobs they're in. But as to your point, there's already a shortage, about 61,000 drivers. And the other thing is that the age of the driver pool it's older. It's oftentimes it's the second job for a person or a third person. Maybe they got into trucking after they were 35 or 40 years old in that case. So, you have a lot of older people who are driving it, people 50, 60, sometimes in their 70s driving, doing it well, but a lot of the trucking driving population is a little bit older, it skews older.
Dan, we've got to say farewell to you. You were with Transit Topics.
Transport Topics.
Transport Topics, and you're also the
Sirius
host
XM.
and Sirius XM channel 146. You do a regular show over there, and again, it's all things related to transportation, things we've talked about. A native, certainly someone that spent a lot of time in Chicago. Dan, we thank you very much for being with us this evening, and our thanks also to Mark Casello for joining us. Ray Lopez, we thank you. Stephanie Hitt, Kent Gray, we thank you all. Our thanks to Hector Pacheco and Fritz Goldman for their assistance in the production of this program. I'm Bruce DuMont. Good night from Chicago.